Hi students, this is Mrs. T and we are going to talk about culture in this lecture. So this is a continuation of the most recent lesson you've seen in your Blackboard class or that we had in our face-to-face class. Both sets of students are getting exactly the same thing. So this lecture picks up where the most recent one left off, where we were talking about the definition of culture, which is the entire topic for chapter 2, and also the importance of value-free sociology. That was our last topic that we kind of backed around to get to pick up on in chapter 1, and leaving our own personal opinions and our own emotions, our personal feelings and our personal beliefs, trying as best we can to leave those things out of our analysis of data that we collect in a systematic way so that we don't have biased results. We don't have, slanted findings when we analyze our data. And so there's two main concepts that you will read about in chapter 2, which the culture chapter, and those two concepts are ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. And I've linked these concepts in the previous lecture to value-free sociology because ethnocentrism, and I'm paraphrasing here, I don't remember exactly the way we worded it the other day when we were talking about that definition, but ethnocentrism is the tendency that everyone has to judge other cultures on the basis of our own. So it can happen on a micro scale with just one person to the next, or it can happen on a macro scale with one country to the next, for instance. And so ethnocentrism is the tendency to judge others based on you. There's good sides and there's bad sides to ethnocentrism. So please, make sure that you go back to that video and watch that. But in general, if we let ethnocentrism get the best of us, then we have a tendency to judge others harshly, and we're not going to be able to have value-free analysis in sociology. On the flip side of that, it's not really the opposite, but it's kind of a cure, or it's kind of a research technique we can try to practice to try to get us out of our ethnocentric tendencies. And that research practice is called cultural relativism. Just like ethnocentrism, it has good sides and bad sides too. But cultural relativism is a research technique where you try to understand concepts and issues from a culture from the point of view of that culture's historical background, the events that people share in common, the norms, the values, the non-material, the material culture that is specific to that cultural group. You don't try to use your own as a measuring tool. You don't do that like ethnocentrism is the tendency that we were going to do. With cultural relativism, you try to stop yourself. You try to stop yourself from using your own background as a measuring tool, and instead really try to focus on understanding another culture from a person's point of view within that culture. And that helps you get away from that judgment. It helps you make another step toward that value-free goal that all of us have and all of us are trying to work on. So that's where we left off. We got a definition of culture, which is a great big long list of stuff. Comma, 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 comma was in that definition. And so today, what we're going to expand, the way we're going to expand on that is take out some of those pieces, some of those bits that were separated by commas in that definition, and look at each of those individually. So you should find that page in your notes where you were last talking about the definition of culture and ethnocentrism and cultural relativism, and let's start picking out some of the issues or some of the topics that were in that definition. For instance, let's talk about symbols and language in particular. So language is definitely part of any culture because you have to have a way to share all of the thoughts and the ideas and the beliefs and the values and the norms and all of those long things in the definition of culture. Remember, part of that definition says that people share the knowledge and the ideas and the non-material culture and the material culture. People share these things with each other and they pass it from one generation to the next. Well, you have to be able to have a means of communication in order to pass your cultural knowledge, your beliefs, etc., from one generation to the next. So when I say language, think past just the words and think to meaning. Language is a set of symbols, and everything in a culture can be used as a symbol. Just listen to the way my voice is changing, and you use it all the time too. You can change the tone of your voice to emphasize a word in a particular way, and you can completely change the meaning of that word. So, one of my favorite examples of this is you can tell somebody with maybe a mean face and mean body language or just a mean tone of voice, shut up, and you have told them a specific message, right? You've given them a specific message. But you can say the words shut up with a very different tone of voice, and you've completely changed the meaning of them. For instance, shut up. That doesn't mean the same thing as it did before when I had a different tone of voice with it. So that tone of voice symbolizes a very different message that I have overlapped onto those words. And so language, the words themselves are symbols because they represent something else. The word cat, for instance, isn't shaped and doesn't sound or, doesn't feel like the animal itself that I'm referring to. But that word cat, we learn specifically that it means that little animal. And language is full of symbols, and that everything around us has symbolic meaning. One of my classes, when we were talking about this, I talked about what colors are. And name me some colors. It was like we were in a kindergarten class. Name some colors. And people started saying purple and green and blue and yellow and, just kept on naming all the colors that little kids in kindergarten were probably learning also at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Monday. But then I said the word Christmas colors. Is that going to change the list of which ones that you say? Or let me say Halloween colors. Let's not skip that holiday. Does that change the list again? So the words that I put on there, as modifiers for the word color completely change the meaning and the symbolism in your mind. So culture is full of symbols. Actions, times of year, the way that we dress, the way that we look at somebody, the way that we touch or not touch, all of these different kinds of parts of our daily lives represent meaning and create reality for us. So language is full of symbols, but culture itself is full of symbols. And a symbol is anything meaningful that represents something else. So for instance, when I am in the hallway at school, walking back and forth to my classroom and my office, I sometimes forget to wear my name badge, but I'm walking around with a whole bunch of dry erase markers. And those dry erase markers usually give a clue to people, if the gray hair didn't already, the dry erase markers usually give a clue to people that, hey, this person has a different role at this school than a student, because students don't typically have a handful of dry erase markers as part of their student toolkit, but an instructor does. And so even when I forget to wear my college t-shirt or my name tag or the cap or whatever I might forget to wear it to identify me as an instructor, if I have those dry erase markers with me, people that communicate something to people, and they come up to me and they ask me, where's this and where's that, and do you know how to do blah blah, because those markers symbolize to them, this lady has a different role here than I do, so maybe she knows something, right? Maybe I can ask her a question. So there's a difference between Sorry, Honda drivers out there, but there's a difference between a Honda and a Mercedes, right? So each of them get you from point A to point B, but if when I say Honda, Mercedes to you, you're thinking, oh yeah, that means something different, then you get it. You get what symbols mean and how you can use symbols to communicate. So culture is full of symbols. Words are symbols. And language matters. Language is directly related to our perception of reality. Communication and the way we perceive others' opinions of us, or the way we perceive a situation, those things determine how we are going to interpret reality, how we are going to remember events. And language, word choice in particular, is vital to understanding reality and building reality. So there are several sections in chapter 2 that break language down, language and creating social reality, like I've been saying, and then language and gender, and how do you perhaps pick out who might have a superior or an inferior position in a society based on the language that is used to talk about males versus females, for instance. There's also a section on race and language and how perhaps you can identify what racial groups in a culture maybe have superiority and which have inferiority in the grand scheme of the social structure. Very interesting sections that you are required to read in chapter 2. And think about the connection between meaning and your perception of reality as you go through your individual social experiences on a daily basis. Look at the different ways that you use language to make other people perceive you in a way that you want to be perceived. For instance, you've got a school persona. You've got a hanging out with your friends persona. You've got a being with your parents and other relatives persona. You've got being at work persona. And being at work when your direct supervisor is there is different than the persona when you don't think the supervisor is there, right? So if you are going through your mind, as I am here, and you can see that your behavior, your language choices, your clothing, whether you do or don't show body art and piercings and things like that you might have in front of certain audiences, then you are already on the right track to realizing how language and social reality are linked. I have lots of students with tattoos, but I had a student once who had just this gorgeous bright tattoo, chest plate, is that what it's called, right here. And she was a server in a restaurant. And at that restaurant, she was required, the restaurant typically had like older people, 50s and older, who typically ate there. And she was a server at that restaurant, and the manager asked her, she was a great server, they wanted her to work there, but the manager said, you will never be able to show that tattoo. And so she had to button her shirt up all the way to her neck, even in our 95-degree weather, whenever she was working. So she had to hide that because, well, you know why, because that image symbolizes something different to the 50 and above age group in our society than it did to the 20-something age group, which she belonged to. And so we had a long conversation with that. Her manager required her to hide it. But also we talked about whether tips would maybe be different for her if she showed that, that tattoo and the people she was waiting on saw it and maybe disapproved. Would it affect the tips that she gets? So any of you out there who are servers know exactly what we're talking about here. It can definitely affect the way in which you make a living. Or the kinds of jobs you are or are not going to be hired to do. So it's an interesting stuff when you think about symbols with different categories of people and what it represents, what these different symbols represent for social reality, based on the perceptions that different categories of people have in a society. Okay, so language is full of symbols. Words are, every word represents some other object or concept. So words are symbols, and symbols are anything meaningful that represents something else. Our culture is full, any culture, not just ours, any and every culture is full of symbols. And our perception of symbols and the communication patterns and the word choice and all of these things built into one affects our perception and the way we live our life as we go day to day. So that's one aspect of culture that's in that long list separated by commas, but it's a huge aspect of culture because if you don't share meaning, if you don't have a common way to communicate, then you don't share a way of life. And that's a key component of culture, is that people in a society share culture and they pass it from one generation to the next. Extremely important concept. Okay, another thing that we're going to pull out of that definition of culture and then kind of dissect it a little deeper is the word norms. Norms are very important for this class. It's one more of the major concepts that we're going to go back to time and time again when we roll on through to the end of the semester. So norms are rules about how people in a society, people in a culture are supposed to behave, but it's also the flip side, rules about how people are not supposed to behave. So norms are a set of rules, but it's rules on two sides of a spectrum. Think about this side of the spectrum. This is the stuff you can do in this culture, and this side of the spectrum, this is stuff that you can't do, you're not allowed to do. And usually there's like a gray fuzzy area kind of in between. And that gray fuzzy area is that there's some behaviors that we just haven't tried yet or that just haven't come up yet. So we don't really know, are they going to be accepted in this culture or are they going to be not accepted in this culture? Because we just haven't tried it yet. So, for instance, I think we used this example in one of my classes. There's a lot of hunger in not only our country, but lots of countries worldwide. And horses have a whole lot of meat on them. And some societies in the world already have horse meat as a very commonly eaten thing. And so I wonder, would our society, since in the United States, we don't have horse meat as a very commonly consumed, if at all, option for people to choose from. But we have so much meat on that animal, and there's so many people who are hungry, and so why not? So there's a gray area thing. Just for those of you who are freaking out right now, I'm not advocating for horse meat consumption at all. So give me a break. We're not advocating for this. However, think about it for a second. This is something that's done in other cultures, so it is a human behavior that you can find around the world. It's just not a behavior that's in our culture. So it's in that gray area. It's possible, it's just not done. So think about it. I wonder, do you think that people would say this is something that should be or is in the acceptable side, or should be or is in the unacceptable side? So you don't really know whether a behavior is acceptable or unacceptable until you try the behavior. So norms are rules about what is acceptable in a society, but also what is not acceptable in society. And we learn norms as we go through life by trying out behaviors. We try them out. So the way we know growing up The way we know whether something is going to be accepted is by doing it, and do we get a favorable response or do we get an unfavorable response? So the vocabulary word I'm talking about now that goes with norms is called sanctions. A sanction is a reaction to a behavior. If you get a positive response to a behavior, then that is a behavior that you can comfortably say is acceptable. If you get a negative reaction or a punishment to a behavior, that's behavior that you can logically say, okay, it's in the unacceptable side, especially if you try it repeatedly and you get the same negative reaction each time. And so think about little kids. Little kids, we have to tell them sometimes several times what the rules are before they get it right. We have to often give them negative sanctions. No dessert. You can't go over to that slumber party that you wanted to go to so badly because you're going to have to remember this next time. It's not acceptable. Or, you've been so good. What a good little girl. I'm going to get you an ice cream cone because you've been so good. So clearly I want that little girl to repeat that kind of behavior, so I'm giving her a reward to reinforce what it was that she did. Be a good girl again. So a sanction is a reward or a punishment that's given in response to a certain behavior, any behavior. And I'm using silly examples like getting a good little girl an ice cream cone, but sanctions can also be pretty severe. Depending upon the importance of the behavior in society. So we're back to symbolism again. Some behaviors are not such a big deal. Other behaviors are a very big deal. And so we perceive reality based on what the behavior symbolizes. So we have different types of norms and these are all vocabulary words also, these different types of norms. So we categorize norms based on not so severe to extremely severe in order to figure out what's important in society. So norms in general are behaviors about what's acceptable and not acceptable. A sanction is like a reaction to those, to behaviors. Were you punished? Was it received favorably? Nobody reacted negatively? So you can interpret the meaning of that communication to know whether your behavior is acceptable or not. There are 3 types of norms. From not so severe, we're going to start with the not so severe one, to extremely severe or important. Okay, so the first type of norm that is not so severe, but still it's important to maintain these things in society. The first type of norm, excuse me, is called a folkway. Folkway. One word, folkway. This is just a commonplace, everyday behavior. Just nothing unusual, no big deal. You hold a door open for somebody who you can see is coming in behind you. There is a folkway having to do with politeness. You can eat your French fries with your fingers and dip them in ketchup and eat them, and that's fine. That's a folkway that's perfectly acceptable. You get a bowl of mashed potatoes, and not French fried potatoes though, and you are not able to eat those mashed potatoes with your finger. This is against a folkway. We have acceptable folkways. We have not acceptable behaviors associated with folkways. So norms are the bigger topic. Norms exist kind of on the macro scale for different cultures, and we're going to get into what subcultures mean and countercultures probably in another video. But norms pretty much span an entire society, an entire culture. There's a little asterisk on that because there's going to be some exceptions we're going to talk about. And since norms are about acceptable behavior and also unacceptable behavior, so are folkways. So are each of the 3 types of norms. So you have folkways that are not very important norms. If all of a sudden we started eating our mashed potatoes with our fingers, maybe there would be some getting used to, some lag time. You can read about culture lag in your textbook also. However, the sky wouldn't fall in. the sky would not fall if we began eating mashed potatoes with our fingers. Again, I am not advocating for changing basic table manner norms. However, we're using this as a silly example. So folkways are simply not so earth-shattering. So we expect you to hold a door open or help somebody across the street or have basic common polite behaviors when you're in public, at least. That's the basic expectation. So if you don't do those things, you would have some sanctions associated with it. If you weren't in general polite in public, you probably would not have made very many friends in your life. You probably would not have won very many arguments, in your life. People wouldn't be on your side. I mean, you would have some issues with trying to get along with strangers, at least. Excuse me. So basic norms for politeness, for table manners, for our hygiene, for the way that we dress, for the way that we drive, and for the, just the general plan of our life. These things come in the package that we call Folkways, and that's one of 3 types of norms. Okay? Another type of norm is extremely important to society. We put a lot of value on this type of norm. So number 2 is called mores. M-O-R-E-S. Mores. Okay. Mores are extremely important norms because they are usually based on morality or values of right versus wrong. So we have acceptable and unacceptable. Those are really kind of they're not severe terms, but in the realm of mores that we're talking about right versus wrong, justice, injustice, beauty, ugliness, good, evil. We're talking about those kinds of differences. So there are mores in any society, and those are the more severe, more important norms that if you don't follow the acceptable side of those norms, you are going to have some serious consequences. The sanctions will be serious. For instance, in our society, we've talked about marriage patterns before, and we have a norm for one spouse being married to one spouse and only one spouse at a time. So 2 people in a marriage, only 2 people at any time. They're supposed to have sexual fidelity between those 2 people. And if we find out that one of them is not faithful to that more, then there's severe sanctions. Usually split up. Or if there's children, maybe somebody takes this side and somebody takes that side. There could be financial problems. There could be all kinds of issues that happen because you have violated that really important expectation for your behavior in a marriage. Mores. Really important expectations. You better follow the acceptable side because there's serious consequences if you're in the unacceptable side of those mores. Okay. So sometimes mores and folkways can overlap a lot. So for instance, there are some jobs that aren't really acceptable jobs or, okay, let me say this. For instance, if you are going to career day, if your 3rd grader has come home and said, Mommy, Daddy, whatever, it's career day next Thursday at school, and all the parents are going to come in and talk about what they do for a living, and I want you to come in and maybe bring what you do. So if you're a nurse, or if you're a firefighter, or if you're a doctor, or if you're a school teacher, or whatever it is, do you have any qualms whatsoever about going to career day at your son's 3rd grade classroom? Probably not. Probably sounds like I've just rattled out a whole bunch of folkways to you. Well, what if your job is you're a stripper? There's good money in that, I'm told. But what if that's your job? It's perfectly legal. You're not doing anything illegal. But is that the kind of career that you can go to your son's third grade classroom on career day and talk about with the third graders. Um, sure, you can go and talk about that. Are there going to be consequences? Are there going to be sanctions? Well, I'm just going to guess that probably so. Your son, the third grader, if he wants to have his, McDonald's Playland birthday party a couple weeks after career day and sends an invite to everybody, and all the other parents heard what it is that you do for a living, do you think they're going to send their kids to your birthday party? Your son's birthday party? Do you think that you're going to be volunteering for any of the field trips and that kind of thing that they need chaperones for, and you're going to get a call back for that? Are you going to be invited to join the Parent-Teacher Association? These are the kinds of sanctions that you might get if there is a line crossed in people's ideas about what right or wrong is, what appropriate and inappropriate is. And so the age group we're talking about here matters. Adults wouldn't necessarily judge you in the same way as parents. Just in general, if there weren't children involved, the parents by themselves might not judge you in the same way than if the kids heard this and they had to ask questions and perhaps be influenced by this particular career choice of yours. So mores are extremely important norms that really people in society hold so important that they might fight you. They might, really band together and work to resist something that you might want to introduce in a society, for social change, for instance, if they think your direction that you're going in is really contrary to what the fabric of society is all about. So mores are very, very important. As a matter of fact, some of you, when I used the horse meat example a minute ago, some of you probably were so shocked at that you maybe would consider that that's not a folkway, that that's like mores, because horses are pets. Horses have helped us with wars and help us with westward expansion and etc., right? So horses have a different symbolism in society than supper. Other animals represent supper, not a horse to us. And so some of you maybe have, thought that that was way more severe than just a folkway. So mores are extremely, extremely important norms. Sometimes mores are so important that if you violate them, it's something called a taboo. Excuse me. A taboo is something so important that you cannot violate. You absolutely can't violate that and still be allowed to be part of culture, to be part of like the mainstream culture. So you can read about these differences in the textbook. There's one more type of norm on our list of 3 types of norms, and that last norm is called a law. A law is any norm that was written down. There's a word you'll read in your textbook. It's called codified. Codified means you make something a code, you write it down. So a law is any norm that is written down. The sanctions that go with laws are also written down. So the speed limit is a law. It's written down. If you violate the speed limit, what happens? Well, some of you are already thinking to yourself, well, it depends on how fast over the speed limit you're going, right? Because on the little ticket, at least I'm told, I've never seen one, hint. Some people tell me that there's like different speed ranges, 5 miles over, 10 miles over, 15 miles over, and the money is different, right? On how you have to pay, how much you have to pay for that fine. So anyway, the ticket that you would get if you're pulled over, it even has written down what the sanctions are. That's based on how severely you were speeding, right? So the speed limit is a law, just like murder is a law, right? There's a law against murder. Did you plan it? Was it an accident? Was it, heat of the moment kind of thing? There's different degrees of murder, and the sanctions for those things, if you are found to be guilty, the sanctions for those things are written down also. If it was the heat of the moment and you would take it back if you could and you really didn't mean it, there's a much lesser penalty. It's a severe penalty, but there's a much lesser penalty than if you planned this out methodically and waited for the exact time that you brought everything together and bang. There's a much different kind of penalty for that that's written into the law, written into the code. So a law is any norm that's written down, and it ranges from not so severe, like jaywalking. One of my students said she got a $25 ticket for jaywalking one time. So jaywalking is a law, it's written down, and it's not so severe, right? 25 bucks is what she got for jaywalking one time. Whereas a capital murder charge, I'm running a huge spectrum here from jaywalking to murder and anything in between, but you would expect, excuse me, something much more than a $25 fine for that kind of issue, right? It's for something that goes down toward the severe side of that. So there are 3 types of norms. Folkways are not so severe. They're common, everyday, important things for just daily life, but not essential to the fabric of society. Mores, on the other hand, use values and the idea of right and wrong, or issues of morality, in order to determine what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And then a law really ranges from folkways to mores. It can be something very, very simple and really not so important, all the way to extremely, extremely important that is entirely unacceptable for society. And so a law is written down, and it can really be based on either of the other two, something not so important or something really super important. And so they're written down, they're laws. Okay, so something's going on with my throat and I'm coughing a little bit, so I'm going to end this lecture a little bit sooner than I wanted to. So you're going to have another discussion from me about Chapter 2 before we finish up, and then we're going to move into Chapter 3. And so you'll have at least 3 lectures, this is one of them, at least 3 lectures this week while I'm gone, and I've got my phone with me. So text me. I will respond as soon as possible. It might not be as quick as normal when I'm at home, but please contact me if you have any questions, and make sure you look for that test that I made the announcement about, because you will need these notes and the notes from the next 2 lectures, or 3 if I end up with 3, in order to be able to finish that test successfully. Thanks!